My name is Derek Taylor, also known as DT, and this is my YouTube channel, DistroTube, which is also known as DT. It's almost like I planned that. And today what I wanted to cover was I wanted to introduce myself a little bit and provide you a little backstory as far as my origin story with computers and software, and especially Linux and free and open source software. It's been a few years since I've done one of these introduction style videos. I think the last one I did was almost 5 years old now, and these are good to do every year or every couple of years because of course new people find your channel, right? I've been here on YouTube for about 8 years, and some of you guys have been around since nearly the beginning, but of course we get thousands of new viewers every month, people just now discovering the channel, and oftentimes they're not going to go into the back catalog and look for older videos, especially as many videos as I have, nearly 2,000 videos. Are they going to go back and try to watch every one? It would be very difficult. So this is going to be a little bit of an updated introduction to the YouTube channel. It will also serve as a nice little introduction over on my Patreon as well. If you're not subscribed to DistroTube over on Patreon, I'd appreciate it if you guys would go and help support me over there, because it really does help, because I don't really make a lot of money here on YouTube. YouTube pays a little bit, the AdSense on YouTube, but you're not, YouTube is one of those ventures that you're not going to get rich on, right? And if you find a creator, then you find value in their work, and so much work goes into the whole video process, as far as recording the videos, editing the audio, making thumbnails. It's a ton of work. And if you find creators that you really want to support, you really want to continue seeing their content, please help those creators out. Give them a few bucks if they have a way for you to support them. In my case, I'm using Patreon as that way to support me. So let's get into my origin story. So I was born in the 1970s, but really I was a child of the 80s, the 1980s. And when I started school, elementary school, we had computer labs. Computers were not common items that people had in their homes. They were very expensive, and it was kind of rare for anybody to actually have a home computer, a personal computer. It was very weird. Like if you had a friend that had a computer, it was like the coolest thing. You'd go over to their house so you could play, whatever games they might have had on the computer at the time. But I remember quite vividly the computer lab at my elementary school, because we'd go there every day for an hour period or whatever, and we have little classes, although the classes, you would think we would be doing tech related things, and we did a little bit. We do some basic programming, like hello world kind of scripting, and things like, I don't know, basic or whatever programming languages we were using back then. But that was very unusual for us to actually do anything on the computers other than gaming. It seemed like most of the time when we went there, the teacher just let us play games because we were kids, and computers, I mean, that's what kids want to do on computers. I remember playing Donkey Kong on those computers. I remember playing the original like Oregon Trail game, which was just amazing. I can't remember exactly what brand of computers these were at the time, but these were your old school computers, your monochrome monitors with the amber colored text and everything, and this ancient by today's standards. But I didn't have a computer at home. As a matter of fact, I didn't have a computer for several years after that. What really wasn't into the early 90s that I had a home computer. I remember sometime in the 90s, my grandfather had a computer. He bought a computer. It was an old Tandy computer, and he had a game on it. Where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? Like the first one. And I always went over to his house just to play that game because it was so cool. And eventually I wanted a computer because I wanted to play cool games, right? This was before the internet. The internet was still, well, the internet existed, but the World Wide Web really didn't exist for another couple of years after this story. So, I went and I got a job. I was like 16 years old. I started working all the time. I saved up like, I don't know, $2,000, $3,000, a lot of money to buy my first computer. If you're somebody that is not from that time period, you're going to go, wow, that was a really expensive computer. No, that was just what they cost at the time. Back then, again, not too many people had computers, and they weren't cheap. right? They were expensive things. And, I had to work my ass off as a kid at this job. I was working at a pizza restaurant, and later when I turned 18, I was a delivery driver. I worked for a while to get that money to buy this computer. And then shortly after that, there was the birth of the World Wide Web. And then, everybody was online and communicating with everybody online. I remember some of the original online services. I remember using things like CompuServe and Prodigy, right? Online chat with people from around the world. And it was amazing at the time. Now, remember, back then, in the 1990s, we didn't have cell phones back then. It was a totally different world. If you actually wanted to talk to somebody on the phone, you got either on your house phone or you went to payphones. There were payphones everywhere. You pay a quarter or 50 cents or whatever to talk to somebody locally on a payphone. But if you actually wanted to talk to someone long distance, in another state or another country, it cost a lot of money, right? You had to talk to an operator who sometimes would have to manually patch you in, call that number for you and whatever, international, country code they had to put in. It was a totally different planet, right? It was weird because I remember, back then it was normal to get in a car. If you had to go out of state for something, I might have to drive, 1,000 miles somewhere, to go do something. And we didn't have cell phones, and nobody thought anything of it. You just get in your car and I'm driving, wherever, right? And I never worried about what happens if I break down. Who do I call? Well, you didn't call anybody. Back then you just fixed your own problems. That's the way it worked. If you had a flat tire, you fixed your flat tire, or somebody passing along the highway would hopefully stop and help you out if for some reason you couldn't fix your own tire. But that was the world we lived in. Nowadays, it's so odd because we're tied to our mobile devices, how we, now we can't imagine being without our phones. It's like we're naked without our phones. And in some ways, I kind of think that has been a negative impact on society. But getting back to the first computer that I owned, originally I had Windows 3.1 on it, right? Which was, amazing at the time. But, looking back on it now, it was a pretty horrible operating system. And then the next version of Windows 95, the next major version of Windows, was actually quite a step forward. And then we had the birth of the World Wide Web, America Online, AOL, really exploded on the scenes, I think in 1996. And then it was almost overnight. Everyone had to have a computer and everybody had to be on the internet. We all wanted to be on the internet. And I found the World Wide Web a fascinating place. In the early days of the web, it was just this strange and amazing place full of wonder. And I wanted to create websites. Even in the very early days of the web, I wanted to build websites. So naturally, I had to play with web servers, web hosting, and things like that. And some of those servers, by the way, some of them were Windows servers back then, but a lot of the servers, even in those early days of the internet, were Linux servers. So this was very cool. I got to play with this weird operating system remotely. You had to SSH into machines, or you had to use FTP programs. I remember, I think it was a proprietary Windows only FTP program I think I was using at the time for a couple of years. I was using WSFTP, I think it was. But shortly after that, I discovered that there was free FTP programs, free of cost. And some of these were actually free and open source software. I remember finding FileZilla like around 2001. And to this day, 25 years later, I still have FileZilla installed on all of my computers just in case I want to remote into other machines using the FTP protocol. And this was kind of the start with me discovering open source software. A lot of it was originally I just wanted free software, as in free of cost. I didn't want to pay for some of the proprietary software back then when I was using Windows. I remember using things like PaintShop Pro as a paint program, an art program, image editor, whatever you want to call it, PaintShop Pro, which was, looking back on it, it was a horrible program, but it was paid for software, proprietary software. And I didn't want to pay for a license. And I discovered GIMP. I want to say I discovered GIMP like in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think it was even back in the 90s, GIMP was around. And you know what? GIMP was pretty good, right? I was actually amazed at this program that looked like it could do everything that this proprietary program I'd been using could do, but I didn't have to pay for it. And that was originally my gateway into the door, right, with free and open source software. And then later it really became about the browser, the web browser I wanted to use. And then I got into the ideology behind free and open source software. Because when I first got into computers, the dominant web browser was a program called Netscape Navigator, right? Even though Windows had Internet Explorer, everybody kind of used Netscape Navigator. It was the de facto standard. And then Microsoft, through some very shady practices, basically extinguished Netscape Navigator. They made it almost impossible for you to run Netscape Navigator on Windows, and they made it impossible for you to remove Internet Explorer from Windows. And basically, they just were trying to force everybody that used the Windows operating system, you had to use Internet Explorer. And there was a lawsuit, an anti-monopoly lawsuit against Microsoft. They lost that lawsuit, and they had to pay millions of dollars. They were almost broken up as a monopoly by the US government, but they succeeded in what they wanted to do. They killed Netscape Navigator. And through that whole shenanigans that they played with that, I decided I was never going to use Internet Explorer, just out of on principle. I couldn't use Internet Explorer. But shortly after Netscape died, the Mozilla Foundation was created and Firefox came out, and I just started using the Firefox browser. I used Firefox for like 20 years, again, because I wasn't going to use Internet Explorer. And even to this day, Google Chrome now is the dominant proprietary browser on most systems. And, why would I use proprietary software like Google Chrome or now Microsoft Edge, things like that, when we have so many great free and open source browsers out there now? Right now, the browser I'm daily driving is the Brave browser, which is fantastic. I remember in the early 2000s, probably somewhere around 2002, 2004, I needed to do some stuff in Office, Microsoft Office, which is proprietary software. Again, I was cheap. This was about mainly free, as in free of cost software. And then I discovered OpenOffice, which was this free and open source Office suite. It was your free and open source alternative to Microsoft Office. And it was fantastic. And OpenOffice eventually was forked, and LibreOffice sprang from it. And to this day, I use LibreOffice. Even if Microsoft Office was a free program, I'm not sure I would use it over LibreOffice. Like LibreOffice, the word processor, fantastic. The spreadsheet program, fantastic. Their presentation program, fantastic. So even when I was still on Windows on all of my home computers, I was already on a lot of free and open source software. Probably a lot of the stuff that I lived in most of the time was free and open source software. The browser, the Office suite, the image editor, all open source software. But I was still using a proprietary operating system, Microsoft Windows. At the time, I was using Windows XP. And then one day, that Windows XP installation was taken over by ransomware. Basically, a hacker took over my computer. He put this message on the computer that I had to send him a certain amount of money. And if I did, he'd send me the, quote, antivirus program that would remove the virus that he put on my computer. He'd give me my computer back if I paid him a few bucks. And once again, just based on principle, there's no way in hell I was going to do that, right? So I already knew what Linux was because I played with it on servers. I knew that some people were using Linux on their home computers. And back then, this was around 2008. Ubuntu came on the scene around, really Ubuntu exploded on the scene around 2006. Like it was big news. Like, hey, do you know there's this Linux operating system that's not just for servers anymore? Like you can actually use it on your home computer. You saw it all over the web, especially on web dev forums and nerdy places I would hang out on sometimes. I saw people running Ubuntu on their home computers. And now I've got this Windows XP machine that's taken over by ransomware. It's like, well, these other people are running Ubuntu on their machines. They seem to be doing okay with it. And I had a CD of Ubuntu at the time because I played with it a little bit on test equipment or whatever. So what I did is I just put that CD of Ubuntu in the drive, formatted the drive. That Windows installation just wiped it out right then. Lost all my data, didn't care, couldn't get my computer back without paying the ransomware guy. I just formatted the drive, installed Ubuntu 804 or whatever it was at the time, and that was it. And since that day, I've never owned a computer that wasn't running Linux. And the transition for me from moving from Windows over to Linux was very smooth. And partly it was very smooth because I'd already been using so much free and open source software. And when I got to Linux, you know what the major programs that are installed out of the box on most Linux operating systems are? They're free and open source software. So the default web browser on Ubuntu was Firefox. I was already using Firefox. Their default image editor was GIMP. I was already using GIMP, right? It's like they were using OpenOffice as their Office suite. I was already on, like, it was crazy, you know, how much software was already there on the Ubuntu installation that I was going to use anyway. And yeah, I just loved it. Also, the speed, you know, the Linux operating systems were so much faster than Windows, and especially Windows at the time. Was that Windows XP installation was very slow on my computer because I'd had that XP installation for a long time, and you know, over time it gets slow, right? The Windows installations really can slow down on you over time, and this new Ubuntu installation was just, it was really peppy. I was blown away by how fast it ran. And on that computer at the time was not a great machine. And I remember just being like a kid in a candy store, discovering all of this fantastic free and open source software that was in the Ubuntu Software Center, because, you know, you had a proper software center, a proper package manager. You know, on Linux, we have these things called package managers where you can go find thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of software just sitting there ready for you to download, install, and try out. And this was mind-blowing because on Windows, you just scoured the internet for random Windows executable files, and then you hoped they weren't viruses. Half the time they were viruses. That's almost certainly how I got ransomware on my installation, was going and downloading random programs off the internet. Well, on Linux, you know, you've got the central repositories for your Linux distribution, and it's all a curated list of stuff in there, and it's perfectly safe. You know, you really don't worry about spyware and ransomware and malware when you're installing things directly from your Linux distro's repos. The Ubuntu desktop at the time was the GNOME 2 desktop environment, and I liked it. It was okay. But, you know, I wanted to explore some other things. So about 6 months after I made the switch from Windows to Linux, I immediately started hopping around to different desktop environments and window managers. And essentially, I jumped into window managers immediately. I found the OpenBox window manager, installed it, and I loved it, you know, because it was very minimal. You know, you had to configure it. You had to write your own config files, and, you know, it was kind of nerdy. And I liked that nerdy aspect. And I loved the flexibility and the customization options with that particular window manager, OpenBox. And then shortly after that, I moved to the awesome window manager, which was a whole other level of nerdy, and then to Xmonad, which was, you know, peak nerdiness, right? And I just loved it. You know, I had so much freedom when it comes to customizing my computer, right? It was a level of freedom you just don't get with Microsoft Windows or the Mac OS for that matter. And from there on, I just kept trying out new software and new desktop environments, new window managers. I also distro hopped a lot, especially in the first few years of me using Linux. You know, I was on Ubuntu for a while, then I was on Debian for a while. Here in the last 7 years or so, since I started the YouTube channel, I prefer living on Arch Linux or Arch Linux-based distributions because I like having the latest and greatest software. It helps me for what I do for purposes of this YouTube channel. But I've tried out most every Linux distribution at one time or another, either in a VM or on physical hardware. I've tried probably 30 on physical hardware. I've probably tried 300 different Linux distributions in virtual machines. And I would say as the years progressed, I gravitated more and more to the command line. I found the command line utilities, so your standard GNU core utils and things like that. Yeah, I just live in the shell, live in the bash shell. These days I'm using the fish shell as my primary interactive shell. And then I discovered the wonderful world of extensible text editors. So I would say 6-8 years ago, I discovered Vim, really went into Vim kind of hardcore. And then about 4 years ago, I moved to Emacs, which was a whole nother level of customization. And again, mind blown, right? It was one of those things, again, nobody really has the kind of freedom we have here with Linux and all of this wonderful free and open source software that, you know, if you know a little programming, know a little scripting, the kinds of customizations you can make to your programs is really something truly special. And that's kind of where I'm at today as far as Linux, free and open source software, some of the software I'm using right now. You know, and as far as content on this channel, that's mainly, you know, a lot of the stuff you just heard me talk about is the stuff that I have videos about. I've got videos about pretty much every program I've talked about. You know, we do a lot with the shell and the various command line utilities. I've got a ton of videos on Vim. I've got a ton of videos on Emacs. I've got a ton of videos on a lot of different tiling window managers. Here lately, in the last year and a half to 2 years, my primary tiling window manager that I'm living in is actually Qtile. And of course, one of the primary types of videos I make are distro first looks, where I go grab the latest release, the new release of whatever distribution, and I take it for a spin inside a virtual machine to check it out and give you my first impressions of that particular Linux distribution. I also do videos about just the whole ideology and philosophy behind the free software movement, the open source software movement, and occasionally I do venture off topic as far as not necessarily tech related topics, but you know, sometimes I will do certain life topics, especially, you know, things that I want to be thought provoking sometimes in my content. So sometimes I will do almost like self-help kind of content. It's not a big part of what I do here, but every now and then it is nice to turn on the camera and do something that is not strictly tech related. So there you have it, a little bit about me and my origin story. Now, before I go, I need to thank a few special people. I need to thank the producers of this episode. I need to thank these guys right here: Matt, Steve, Cap, Caveman, Darloff, Lee, Mythos, Urion, Paul, Peace, Arch, Fedora, Realities for Less, Red Prophet, Roland, More Gentoo, and Ubuntu, and Willie. These guys are my highest tier patrons over on Patreon. Without these guys, I couldn't do what I do without their support. I also couldn't do what I do without the support of each and every one of these fine ladies and gentlemen. All these names you're seeing on the screen right now, these are all my supporters over on Patreon because, again, I don't have any corporate sponsors. I depend on you guys. So if you like my work, want to see more videos about Linux and free and open source software, subscribe to DistroTube over on Patreon. Peace, guys.